I'm Joel Andrew. I'm an attorney based here in Portland, Oregon, represent clients mostly in Oregon, exclusively music clients, so musicians, labels, and other kind of music businesses. Also, as Celia mentioned, I'm on the board for the Oregon Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts as a treasurer. And then let's hear what else. I'm also a business executive, and so that's kind of most of what I do. So again, just music, lots and lots of music. Was previously president for a company called CD Baby, chief of staff for a company called DistroKid, and currently COO for a company called Materia Music Inc. If you're outside of the music industry, those all sound like really silly names, but if you're in the music industry, they're kind of cool, some cool jobs that I've had over the years. And then also, as Celia mentioned, I'm a musician, so play in bands here in Portland, recording artist. I used to be a full-time touring musician, which was kind of what got me into this whole world of representing creatives because I needed a lot of representation for myself because I was doing the contracts, for my own works for small labels, for performance agreements, all that sort of stuff, all the way up to running major licensing agreements for like between CD Baby or DistroKid and companies like Spotify or Amazon. Um, so we'll talk a little bit about the contract necessary stuff that you should know from the legal practitioner's perspective, but then also I'll intro or I guess provide some perspective of what I've needed as a creative, and kind of like what that experience is and some of the disconnect between legal and creative. And then also some of my kind of experience with negotiation, like on the business development side that I've done historically. So looking forward to the Q&A. This probably should, I'm hoping to hit Q&A by 1, but we'll see how we can get there. And then I have kind of like a punchline thing before everybody goes at about 12:55, or not before everybody goes, but if you have to go, I'll make sure to hit some big points there. But obligatory disclaimer, because we are lawyers, or many of us are, this is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice based on a review of individual circumstances. Essentially, you can read it for yourself, but what that means is this is what we just kind of tell people at cocktail parties or like our friends and family. This isn't actually how we apply the law to your specific circumstance. So this is very general how things work. This isn't really legal advice on how you should do things with your particular circumstances. That's where you'd want, when you have circumstances that are kind of outside of the box here, are very individual, that's where you'd reach out to us at the Oregon Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, as Sealy said. It's like a $20 application fee, and you would get to meet, like I'm a volunteer there. We would sit for an hour together and work through your specific issues. And there are many attorneys that are better than me. That's for sure. So, what we'll cover. Do I need a contract? We'll actually start with what is a contract, just to make sure we're all on the same page, but doesn't need to go here. Do I need a contract? How do I source a contract? Like if I do need one, how do I get one? Another one is like, how do I negotiate a contract? Like what's expected? Nobody's really a full-time negotiator career. We're creatives. So we'll talk a bit about how to negotiate. Also, we'll talk about some contract structure, like what goes in a contract, what doesn't, especially if you've never seen one for the first time. Hopefully, we can get some time to crack open a couple that I frequently use. What are common clauses? What should maybe you expect to see in an agreement that you don't, and maybe that's weird? Or what do you see in agreement that is like, I don't know what this does. Let's talk a bit about that stuff. And then specific common contracts for creatives. So service agreements, licensing agreements, non-disclosure agreements, the various things that you as a creative probably see when you're working with clients and other collaborators. And then hopefully we have some time for Q&A. There we go. We'll jump into it. So, as I mentioned, do I need a contract? But first, what does a contract really do for me, or what is a contract? So, just at the before the contract, there is an agreement, and the agreement is it's the meeting of the minds, is the legal phrase of it. The meeting of the minds between two parties about essentially a transaction. So, what does that mean? Is like I'm going to sell it. Hey, do you want to buy my jacket for 10 bucks? And then Sealy says, yeah, I'd totally buy your jacket for 10 bucks. All right, we have an agreement. Do we need a contract? Do we need to document this contract? What if Sealy doesn't give me $10 but still takes my jacket? All these little things about like what a contract could help with, we'll talk about. But just first there's this agreement, then we're memorializing it or documenting. It's the documentation of the agreement. That's ultimately what the contract is. Sometimes I will use the same word as agreement, but really what I mean by a contract is the documentation of the agreement. And it really matters when it comes to enforceability and proof. It's difficult to prove that, hey, Sealy was supposed to buy my jacket for $10 unless maybe there's something in writing. Humans have a great ability of forgetting stuff left and right. And so it's contracts are really about enforceability and proof of what that agreement was. It also, and we'll talk about why, how a contract should be valuable for you, but it really should articulate the rules of the relationship. Like what is, when is Sealy going to give me $10? When does Sealy actually get my jacket? What happens if I need my jacket for another week? All this kind of stuff. And then also, most importantly, how and when the money flows should be documented in the agreement. If the agreement doesn't say anything about money and the contract relates to money, which pretty much most of the ones that are in front of me that I see have some sort of money mechanism in them, it needs to be in the contract. That needs to be what's in the kind of documentation of the agreement. So what does it really do for me? It documents the agreement. It gives me enforceability. It outlines the rules of how this is going to go. And it tells me when I'm getting my money or I have to pay my money. So I keep pressing the wrong button to move forward. Do I really need a contract? So this is a good question for creatives. And I get it a lot. And I actually have to several times in the OVLA clinics, I will just introduce the concept of maybe you don't need a contract. Maybe a contract is the wrong thing to go after. So you can have a transaction, you can have an agreement, you can have all these things kind of happening for your career, but do you actually need a contract in order to make those things happen? I think that should be really the first question for a creative is, do I really need one? Because like, if it's a couple of buddies, it's a low stakes deal. It doesn't really matter if everything goes according to the rules, but it's definitely going to get done. Maybe that's a lot of work that you don't need to put in. But as we're thinking through that, here are the four rules that the my colleague Noah Moore who's also a board member at the OVLA came up with the last one. The four rules for a contract for creatives when questioning, do I really need one? So the first one is just a contract can take many different forms. That's the big one. It doesn't have to be this thing on parchment written in blood, all this sort of fun formality of like what, and say a lot of ye's and these and therefores. It can be very informal. Again, it can just be as minimal as the agreement. If it's easy to enforce and you don't need something to be documented, it could be it doesn't even need to get documented. But on the formal and informal agreements, back of the napkin, people talk about those sorts of agreements. Those are just as enforceable as a formal agreement. Again, that's documented with DocuSign and all that sort of fun stuff. It could even be the front of the napkin, which is very odd to me that everybody talks about the back of the napkin, but I digress. It can be formal or informal. It can be oral or written. Again, these are agreements. But then there's what's called the four corners approach. And this is the more formal side. That's if it's not in the contract, written in the contract, anything else that was talked about outside of that isn't really in the contract. So sometimes when you're doing a transaction or a licensing deal or going to sign to a label or you're going to sell some artwork or assign some attributions from design, there's all this kind of fun fluff stuff you talk about with each other socially. This is a great idea. And then when you actually start documenting the contract, it's called the four corners approach. That's actually what the agreement is what is anything else that was talked about in the agreement what is actually in the contract of what's very enforceable. We'll talk a bit more about enforceability, but just to ultimately highlight, a contract can take many forms. It doesn't just have to be a formal document. But when there is a formal document, anything that's in that formal document is the only thing that matters on the agreement. So the second rule is a contract should ultimately make your life easier. So if a contract isn't going to make your life easier, it's just not worth it. So what makes my life easier in a transaction between me and Celie to sell my jacket is, what are the clear expectations? This is, it's supposed to rain this week, but it's raining now. I don't want to sell my jacket maybe, or I want to hold on to it longer or something like that. But if it's in the agreement or documented and it can be by email, sometimes we can talk about some of that email contract stuff. It sets the clear expectations of what I'm supposed to be giving up in what I'm supposed to be receiving. So I'm giving up my jacket, receiving $10, sets clear expectations as opposed to ambiguity. And so a contract makes things easier if it really clarifies what is actually happening and our brains don't get too fuzzy. It also should assist in adversarial times. It's what you pull out when things go south, when things go poor. And it's like, hey, how is this actually supposed to go? Let's just look at what the agreement says. It's the rule book in the box of the sorry game. This is whether or not you get to move this many pieces or not. And then also it should provide a professional foundation and continuity. So it just kind of, I guess it makes the other party know that you're taking this seriously. So does it make your life easier? It has to. If it's not going to make your life easier, it's probably not worth making a contract. Just stick with the agreement or the informal relationship. But it should make your life easier if you're creative. Otherwise, it's not worth it. Another way to look at that is the benefit should outweigh the cost. So the contract itself should make your life easier. If it doesn't, it's not worth it. But then also what you put into that contract and how formal you get with that contract should outweigh the costs. And that's not only the cash, but it's also your time. You're a creative that should go do creative things. Putting a bunch of effort into making a 20-page agreement for a very simple transaction is just overkill. And you don't need to do that. The contract should only be as formal and organized and as long as what continues to add value to the relationship. So you don't need a contract. You don't need a long, and if you do want a contract, you don't need a long contract. If you want a long contract, just make sure that it is specifically continues to add value and is continuing to outweigh the cost of getting a contract. So, uh, some ways to think about it some more is like, all right, so this is going to take me 2 hours to put together an agreement, kind of convert all of our deal points and put it into a formal agreement of how all this stuff is supposed to go. There's a current expense for me of like 2 hours to put some work into this. Maybe I'd hire an attorney to put it together. So, and that's anywhere from 250 to $750, maybe $1,000 an hour for kind of an entertainment, kind of creative type attorney, business attorney. Um, Usually it's much lower than that in Oregon. But so that's current expense versus future risk. And so if it's a really valuable deal, this is a $10,000 piece of art that I'm selling or assigning to somebody, uh, the potential risk of that falling apart, even though it seems like a pretty straightforward transaction, to me, it would be worth putting in the effort to build the contract not only based off of the current expenses, but also what am I really trying to mitigate? What risks am I trying to avoid down the road? That should impact whether or not it's really outweighing the cost of creating a contract. Another one is reusable. So a lot of creatives I see don't ask attorneys for this. If you hire an attorney to create an agreement for you, you can ask them to make a templatized version of it. So that way, I'm a DJ. I perform all over the place. I want to make sure that my contract isn't just between me and this one party this one time, but it's like my template agreement or my boilerplate agreement or something that I'm just using over and over. And so maybe it is, $700 to create my DJ performance agreement that mitigates future risk. But I can use that again over and over and over. So it's totally fine to ask an attorney if they can create it so that way it's reusable. And that kind of might impact some of the costs. And then future relationships. So the future of relationships is really, I guess, how I would put it, is if I have an agreement today, we just know what the long term, so it's not just like an expense today, but it mitigates risk, but it also establishes what our relationship is ongoing. So it's just like buying a good pair of boots. If it's a good pair of boots, it's going to last you a really long time. investing in an agreement really does help that long-term relationship because everything's essentially evaluated in advance. That's part of the value of a contract. And that person that you're contracting with or entering into the agreement with, again, knows that you're like taking this seriously, and that you're putting, memorializing it, not just kind of like verbally walking through it. The fourth thing, and I think that this is a big punchline at the very end here. When in doubt, keep it straightforward. So, do I even need an agreement? Maybe it's worth it. Maybe it adds a lot of value. Maybe it makes my life easier. But also, if I have one, just make sure that it's straightforward what it is. So, online forms, we'll talk about where you're going to source your contract in a moment. But online forms, hired attorneys, and informal documents just make sure you understand what it is. I think a big thing that clients miss when talking with attorneys, especially creatives, is asking, can you explain why you did this or what does this mean? In your consult call or your follow-up, so if you hired me to build a contract for you, we'd have an initial consult call or communication. I'd start putting an agreement together and then we would connect again to kind of walk through like how everything works. And in that space, you should be asking, like, I don't even know what this means. Could you explain this to me a little bit more? Because if it's not straightforward, you're not really getting what you need. You need to understand it. So just keep it straightforward. But ultimately, mostly an agreement is just logic, but there is some magic language. And what I mean by that is when you look at an agreement, if a paragraph is very clear on what it means, and it is saying the opposite of what you want, only in certain circumstances is there some magic language that changes that to be something different than just pure logic. So I've seen a ton of agreements that have no magic language in it whatsoever. It's just very logical articulation of, I am going to bring my jacket to the restaurant tomorrow. Celia is going to pay me $10 for the jacket right there. We sign it, that's it. There's no magic, you know, we'll get into some legalese language later. The stuff to kind of look for is like work for hire, type stuff or an IP assignment or disclosures. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But for the most part, a contract is just a straightforward documentation. It's mostly just logic. So if you're doing it yourself, you can get pretty far, but there are some circumstances where things can get rough. So do you need a contract? You should be considering these things before you even start putting down, pen to paper. And at the very end, I'll kind of talk about this notepad process that I recommend to clients. So we'll get to there later. So how do I source a contract? The sliding scale of sourcing. I'll give you some uh, to my personal experiences as an independent musician, self-drafting before law school, before undergrad, before community college, any of that stuff. I would self-draft agreements because I knew that they were straightforward, you know, logical documents that I could do for myself. You can't do that for other people. That's kind of being an attorney without being an attorney, which gets you in trouble. But self-drafting, if you're doing it, the tips are just keep it as simple as possible. Don't add a bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be there. Don't try to make it overly formal or legal easy. Again, we'll talk about this notepad process to keep it really simple if you're self-drafting. And then avoid a battle of forms or words. This is like where you're kind of sending emails back and forth, text messages back and forth, which all can be binding agreements. Um, but it's the idea of you're not really on the same page, but there's some documentation somewhere about what the real agreement is. So I sent Celia a couple of emails about the jacket, and it's actually a jacket and pants that are cool and matching and very. She definitely wants them. And then she was at one point being like, maybe I'd pay you $12, but we actually like, if we're going to draft a contract, just make sure to cut the chatter and just focus on like, what are the real terms. That's where the battle of forms of words is. Like there was too many side comments that don't really mean anything. But big thing here, we'll talk about it a little bit later, is AI. Joel, should I just go to ChatGPT and create a contract? And I would say maybe. It's really difficult right now to create a contract from scratch if you're using digital tools at all. Even as an attorney, and not use AI to some degree. Predictive modeling, this is where you're writing an email in Gmail and it like finishes the sentence for you and you just have to hit tab. It predicts what you're going to finish your sentence as, or if you're texting and it's going to predict what your next word is based off of what you've been writing so far. That's a predictive modeling. It gets very, very, very complicated from there, and that's where AI is kind of like LLM learning models and large learning models, and it gets complicated. But essentially, if you've ever been frustrated in what your email is predicting the end of rest of your sentence would be, or if you've ever been frustrated with your lack of options when you're texting on what the next word would be, it's just kind of that for an entire contract. So unless you really, really know what you're drafting, you can get into a bunch of predictions that are really bad and actually suggest the wrong things. And they're trained off of these models are trained off of a lot of bad information and misinformation that's out there. So I think some of my colleagues in the legal community, let alone even on the board at the OVLA, might be a little less cavalier with me about using AI for contract stuff. But I would say if you know what it's doing specifically and you are willing to take on that risk, I don't think that AI is a bad tool inherently. Um, Caveat is that others on the board would want me to highlight that like there is absolutely there are a number of cases in the news these days about sloppy attorneys using AI to create agreements or file paperwork, and it's hallucinating. It's citing lawsuits or cases that aren't real because the objective of AI is just to predict what the next word or paragraph would be. It's not really to process legal stuff. So just self-drafting, again, if you know what it's going to do and what you need it to do, it's a pretty good tool. If you want it to word logic better, it's actually really functional for logic. And again, if a contract is largely logic, it's pretty good, but just be really careful. And if you don't know what you're doing with a contract or what you need it to do, and you're just starting with AI from scratch, I think you can get into a lot of trouble pretty quickly. And that would suck because creative works are so important. Online forms. This is kind of in between self-drafting and online forms. So these are going to be like LegalZoom. There's a few others out there. Just Googling for templates. I think that they're really good referrals. Those things are if it has good web traffic, which you can ask for about on Google, and it's referencing an article at the top of Google of like, this is a good non-disclosure agreement template. It's probably had a very light amount of vetting, but it could help you with like understanding an example of what you're trying to do. I wouldn't necessarily use it just right out of the box, but again, if it's if it's a lower value, maybe like a $200 thing and it's a low risk, maybe you don't even need a contract. An online form might help. But yeah, be critical of your source. Where is it coming from? And avoid significant self-editing. What I mean by that is you download the document and then you change it a whole bunch. That's actually worse than just starting from scratch because you're trying to fit a concept into a thing that it wasn't really made for. So just kind of watch out for that. But self-drafting is only the use of your own time. Online form is only the use of your own time with some kind of pre-made edits. AI is your own time and an odd machine model. And then the attorney. So you can hire an attorney and punchline is balance those costs versus the benefit. You definitely don't need an attorney to create a contract for yourself. um, find the right fit, but just again, some rates. So you can find a pretty junior, inexperienced, a junior attorney that hopefully has some competency in the specific field that you're looking for. I don't know, anywhere in the 150 to 250, maybe $300 range. And they would probably create a contract for you if it's standard in an hour or two. That's very low range. So, anywhere from $400 to $700, is this contract worth it? That's a real good question. That again, that's very low range. If you are, a professional and this is what you do over and over, you might be looking at that 350 to 550 an hour range. tied to, again, maybe this is a $10,000, $20,000 opportunity. Maybe this is your employment for the next year or something like that. Where hopefully you're making, 50, 60, 70 plus. That an attorney in that 350 to 550 range, they're probably going to be experienced. They're going to be practicing for more than 5 to 7 years. Once you start getting into specialties, that's when it's getting into the 550 plus range of, these are people who've been doing it for a long time and are the person that people that exclusively work in this field will go to. These are just rough numbers. These aren't like guaranteed, Joel, tell me where to find this person for this amount of money. But that's kind of the rough ballpark ranges of what I see in the industry right now. And they're going to give you, you get what you pay for often. And you also, if you hire a more expensive attorney, their skin's kind of in the game. They need this agreement or transaction to go through well. And so they're going to be on board for a bit more than just kind of hiring somebody specifically for a contract. But also going to highlight you get an hour of legal advice with an attorney like me for like a $20 application fee. Again, there's kind of like some income thresholds, but that's what the Oregon Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts is for, is even if it's like, hey, you need a 5 hour attorney for this sort of transaction or 5 hours of an expensive attorney, we'll talk through that at the OVLA side of things and kind of what the options are. So how do you source a contract? Self-drafting, it could be worth it. Online forms, it can definitely help make it be worth it a little bit more. And then an attorney can get expensive pretty quickly, but it could be really valuable if it's exactly what you need. So how do you negotiate? So no, probably most people that you're interacting with, unless they have something like business development in their title or sales or something like that in their title, they're not probably a full-time negotiator. And probably they have as much experience as a negotiator as you do. And so just going into it feeling, I mean, it's just a Craigslist transaction basically over and over. Like nobody there is really doing this full time to just negotiate contracts with a creative. So if you're working with a design department or a chief marketing officer or something like that, they probably have some experience. But again, it's not like they do this nonstop. They know how to, you have no power here and they have all of it. So just kind of walk into there going, you're negotiating with somebody that probably doesn't know, isn't super proficient at negotiating as well. That's, I guess, posturing effectively is kind of what I would highlight. But before going into that is really question yourself, what are you bringing and what do they want? So document, like write it out. What are you bringing to this relationship and what do they want from this relationship? And if there's a lot of alignment in that, like you are bringing this beautiful artwork and they need this beautiful artwork for this next project that they're working on, you can have a bit more say in how the deal terms go. And we'll get into a lot of that here quickly. But ultimately, that's the punchline is you just want to align what you're bringing with what they want and then posture effectively based off of knowing that they're probably not super good. It's pretty common to ask for 10, 20, 30% more than what you normally would, just because you will probably negotiate down to a range that you'd probably accept. But in advance of that, just know what you need. What's your bare minimum? What are you willing to walk away from and add 10, 30%? Just go for it. Offer versus acceptance. As you're negotiating, just be really careful about whether or not you're accepting a deal term that kind of comes up later. So even though you might not be agreeing to the full, complete package, sometimes you can be agreeing to something. So just be really clear that you're not agreeing to anything yet. That's sometimes where you'll see the kind of like, I respectfully reserve all rights until we sign this contract. So just be careful about that. And oftentimes in an agreement, there will be, or before the formal contract, will be a memo of understanding or a letter of intent. Those are just kind of informal, short form agreements before that are at least say that we at least agree on these things, and then they have a kind of a reasonable uh, uh, duty to kind of like move those things forward under those terms. So how do you negotiate? You just really need to know what you're bringing, what they want, and just make sure that it's aligned, and then write down in advance what your minimum accepting is. And then I would say it's common to add a little bit more reach for it. Historically, creatives do not appreciate their value enough. And so they don't put that. That's where I'm saying that 10 to 30 is going to come from, is it's probably going to put you in the range that you actually should ask for until you're a maniac and then you ask for way, 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 way too much money. But that probably isn't what's going to happen. So think what it's worth, add 10, 30% and go from there. So what are the common clauses and things to be aware of? So this is actually jumping into a contract. This is what I usually see in a contract. It's going to have a title, preamble, and recitals. Those are kind of like this party and that party are agreeing to this, and with offices here and all this kind of stuff. So title, preamble, and then words of agreement or the purpose. I often think to make a contract like now, therefore, the parties agree to move forward under the following terms or whatever. So you're going to often see that in a formal contract. And then the main provisions are basically the meat of the contract. So this is the services, scope of work, grant of rights, payment terms, indemnification. We're going to walk through these each a bit more as we're moving forward. So title, preamble, kind of what we're agreeing to, and then the meat and the substance of it. And then there's always this like really formal boilerplate stuff at the end that's like acts of God and indemnification terms and all this kind of stuff. That's really fun, and we'll talk about that. And then the kind of important part is the signature blocks, and we'll talk about that at the bottom. There's amendments and addendums and exhibits and schedules. We'll talk about that too. This is the rough outline of a contract structure. So at the top, the biggest things that I'm always looking for in an agreement is, what are the definitions? And so in a contract, usually at the top, there will be like a list of words that says like term means this, sound recording means this, design means this. And so those things will kind of be in a specific definitions section near the top, or you'll see that it's in quotes. If you ever are looking at a contract and you're new to it, you'll see that there's a lot of things in quotes. That's a definition. So they're defining that. And the reason that those things matter is like most contracts are kind of like, or most agreements and the way humans work, it's just like what's reasonable. But sometimes when something needs to be very specific of what we're talking about, what do you mean by the sound recording? Is it these songs or these songs? What do you mean by the design? Is it a PDF or is it an ISD? Like what are we really talking about here? That's going to be defined and needs to be really clear in a contract. Sometimes instead of quotes, it'll be in bold. And so that's kind of what you're looking for. But the definitions are super important to look at because they're defined for a reason in that contract. Entity versus individual is who are you contracting with? Effective date, closing date, date of performance. What is the time frame for all of this to go down? Exhibits, schedules, addendums, amendments. Those are all things that kind of get added to a contract at the end. Exhibits are kind of like the list of previous versions that we've done before, or schedules are like all the publishing compositions that we're referencing. Addendums are when the contract is done and then you add some more to the contract. And amendments are when you have a contract and you want to change something in it. And then pros and cons versus legalese. I really am not a fan of legalese, though for a lot of people it makes it seem formal. If you're a self-representing independent creative that's just doing it on your own, spend way more effort on making the contract logical than making it sound formal and legalese. Because legalese actually does a lot of weird reverse formality stuff. It confuses people on what actually matters. And, I even hate when somebody references the former and the latter just because it's not the way my brain is wired. Then you go into legalese and it's like, this isn't really what we're talking about. So, pros versus cons of legalese. Here's an example. In witness whereof the parties hereunto have set their hands to these presents as a deed on the day, month, and year herein before mentioned. I hate that because it's not the way that I naturally work. It again, it looks formal, but this licensees jointly and severally shall indemnify, defend, and hold harmless, yada yada. There's still some legal jargon in here, but it's not legalese like Shakespeare wrote it. So there's certain things like shall indemnify. That's That's not legalese. That's impactful and means exactly what it does once. And contracts should be short, they should be to the point, they should be logical, and I feel like legalese is a waste of everybody's effort. Other obligatory disclaimers. This is not an exhaustive list, but we're going to go through a bunch of common sections in agreement. It doesn't Every contract doesn't have these. Uh, it can still be a good contract without any of these. But this is just stuff that you're going to see a lot just to empower you as you're going to these, as you're reviewing a contract. And definitely review a contract, even if you're planning on hiring an attorney, unless that attorney is being hired to exclusively save you time. It's so much better to, even if you don't understand a lick of it, at least get a good bearing of where are the definitions, where are the signatures, who are the parties, that kind of stuff is going to save you money when you talk to an attorney. So, biggest thing in a contract is the payment and deliverables. Um, I'll skip over the determining scope. Very legal things. Services are kind of, if you're providing services like I'm doing art or design for somebody, that's a service versus a good is like I'm actually giving them a thing. There's kind of some different contract rules about those two, but into the meat of it, really jumping into the payment terms. Make sure that the contract, if there has to be payment terms, but make sure you're looking for things like, reimbursement for costs, timeline and penalties. I never saw net 30. I always assumed that like when I invoiced somebody, and I'll say what net 30 is, when I would invoice somebody, they would pay me right on the spot. And then when I started contracting more, there would be like net 15, net 10, net 30, net 90, which is they don't actually have to pay you until 30 days after that invoice has been received. So watch out for net 30 and really understand how long, or net 10 or whatever. Make sure that like if you're expecting to get paid when you deliver this, it should not say net anything. It should be specifically what you're receiving. Invoicing structure often, especially if you're dealing with royalties or something like that, they will often provide you a report that tells you how much they used your product. You will then return and give them an invoice for how much of that use was, and then they will pay on that invoice. Just real quickly, small business tip is I really recommend sources like QuickBooks or Wise or something like that. Anything to just make the client be able to help pay you quickly is worth the 10%, 3 to 10%. Just you want to get your cash quick. If you're waiving a lot of money, you can decide that. But there will be kind of like an invoicing structure in the contract. Rejection and improvement for nonconformity. We'll actually do a little bit of a process a little bit later, but this is like what happens when on the deliverable side, uh, you hire me to do a bunch of design, I give it to you, and you don't like it. And is it because it needs an aesthetic preference or non-conformity? The contract should say how all of this works. I see a lot of design stuff say kind of like you get one or two rounds of like feedback. And then after that, it's kind of like it's yours and you're going to start paying for it. And we're not just going to go on infinitely, so you can tweak this and tweak that. And so ultimately, you're just looking for a rejection and improvement, kind of like clauses in the agreement, and make sure that it's really clear how it works. And then shipping and risk of loss. So here's another big one is you hire me to create a sculpture for you. I mail it to you. If it gets damaged in the mail, who is responsible for that? And so you just want to be watching out for the risk of loss in the mail, or I delivered it to your property, but then it was stolen from your front porch before you got to work. Who's responsible for that stuff? Because I did the work, but yeah. So just look for those things with the shipping and risk of loss on the payment deliverable terms. Stuff I'm usually looking for. Term and termination. So this would be like when term is the length of the agreement, and terms are the various things that the contract says. So I hate that there is both term and terms in a contract. And term is really and termination. So in the contract, you should be looking for, how long am I assigning these rights? How long am I actually working for them? When does it start and end? Money, property rights, royalties, disputes, all of that can end when the term is over, or they can continue to live after the term. So just watch out for that. And then signatures. I see this happen a lot where only one, like a business will send a DocuSign or a Hello sign off to a creative who's doing some work for them, and then the business never signs it and returns it. And so, or vice versa. I just see a lot of like orphaned contracts, or maybe where just like one person signed it. So the rule is it must be signed by the person you're seeking to enforce it against. So even though one of you signed it, if it's not the person you're trying to enforce the contract terms against, it's technically not even signed. So definitely dot your I's, cross your T's, and get everybody to sign it. And then also digital signing is pretty common these days. So again, this is like through DocuSign or Adobe or all these different things, and maybe becoming industry standard. And I've seen a few times where disputes could have been resolved if they had used a digital signature tool. There's several ones that are free. I would just mention that it also kind of like feels more formal for counterparties. So just kind of look at it if you haven't explored it. You can absolutely sign it manually. You can absolutely sign it in multiple forms if the contract allows for that. I've done numerous contracts by email and we just send it back and forth saying, yes, I agree to these terms and just with our name at the bottom. So it depends on how formal or informal you want to get, but signatures really, really matter. So get it signed. Um, and then granting language, I'm looking for things that are like, hey, if I hire you to do this design for me and we'll kind of go through an experiment, is this you created the work and you own the work and I'm merely licensing the work and I'm going to be able to put it into my like website, but you own it? Or was this I hired you, the work for hire term is I actually hired you to do this for me, and so I get to own it. The rule is copyright fundamentals. I'll talk about it on November, quick plug. But the rule is whoever essentially created the work owns the copyright unless there's a writing that says otherwise. And that's where you're looking for work for hire or IP assignment or all those sorts of things. So just be really clear in the agreement. What are you, if you're the creative, what are you keeping? What are you assigning? Did you ever own anything in the first place, like if it was a work for hire? Again, copyright fundamentals is going to go through that pretty heavily. Uh, yeah. Ancillary licensing terms. So what this means is like, what are some other things that really matter when, oh, also a lot of dry slides. So here's my dog, just to add some life. And because we're going to do a lot more dry slides, I'm sorry. Ancillary licensing terms. These are like attribution rights. What that means is like, hey, I want to put this stuff, or hey, I'm the creative of this, and you're hiring me to be the creative. I'm the mastering agent on this recording. I want my credits on the back of the record or something like that. And so you will be really clear with what those attribution rights are because I've seen relationships fall apart. The attribution says that you have to acknowledge that I made this under these terms in like in 1 point font on the back of the record. So it's there, but it's not prominent. It's not placed in the right place, all that sort of stuff. So really watch for that. And then portfolio rights. So this is like, hey, I want to put this, I'm a budding designer and I want to put this stuff on my website. I don't want to use it for marketing or confuse that I'm affiliated with you or whatever, but just I want the right to be able to show other clients what I've been able to do for them. And so make sure that that's in the agreement because arguably you arguably do, arguably don't have the right to do that. Again, copyright fundamentals is going to be pretty key for that. And then also integration of confidential information. So what this is like, yes, you have the rights to use my work in your portfolio, but just make sure that there isn't some confidential information in there. Sometimes that can kind of like a pricing sheet or something like that that we've put together. Let's see here. Other ones, representations and warranties. So this is a pretty common one that you'll see in a contract. This is basically promises and guarantees that things are what you say they are. So basically, reps and warrants are, this is a promise that this is true. So I hire Celie to do some design work for a record that I'm going to release in a couple of months. We're going to go through this exercise in a little bit. But I hire her to do this stuff. She's going to put a representation and warranty into the agreement that says that whatever she creates will not infringe on third parties. So it's not going to be, so I can use it free and clear of claims from anybody else. So those are kind of the representations. I'm promising that something is true, and I'm promising it so much that I guarantee or I put a warranty on it that it's true. And if it turns out that the representation or warranty is false, then that's a breach of contract. And we'll talk a little bit about breach here in a minute. And then covenants are so representations are an immediate thing that you're promising to be true. Covenants are a future thing that you're promising will continue to be true. So I'm selling you the original sound recordings to, again, music, sorry. I'm selling the original sound recordings to some old albums of mine. I covenant that I won't re-record them for another 5 years or something like that. So I'm making this promise that I will continue to do something or continue to not do something moving forward. You'll just see a lot of these. Don't get intimidated. Again, just very logical. It's not magic language. It's just, you know, they want you to rep that, you know, that you have the legal right to work in this state or something like that for this type of work or something like that. Those are the reps and warranties that you'll see. So some sample language as an example, the rights granted in this agreement, yeah, this is what I just mentioned, are free and clear of any claims, demands, liens, and encumbrances. You'll see a lot of that type of language. The exercise by company of any rights with respect to the artwork will not infringe or violate the intellectual property rights of any third party. That's essentially a covenant that the company will not engage in this sort of behavior. So you'll see it again, just really straightforward. Indemnification. So this is one that you'll see quite a bit. This is ultimately um, a request from one of the parties that the other party holds them kind of like holds them safe, keeps them safe. So indemnification specifically, and there's kind of like three flavors. Indemnification in general means that I'm going to do what I need to do to like keep Sealy safe in this agreement that we entered into. Indemnification specifically to indemnify means that I will reimburse Sealy if she gets sued for work that I did. So that's just the indemnification side. Defend means that I'm going to actually step in or pay for the legal fees to defend Sealy in a lawsuit if she gets sued for work that I did. And then held harmless is even further is I'm going to I have to completely step in. Sealy doesn't have to do anything. I have to handle the defense. I have to pay any damages. I have to do all that sort of stuff to be held harmless. And so, again, back to the negotiating leverage. And if there's real, they really want what you have to give and you have some positioning, I would argue that this needs to be mutual at minimum. But if it's a real big client that you want to work with, or a customer or a consumer or something, maybe you're not going to get these terms into it because, and maybe the company will demand it. So, but that's how they work. Is indemnification has three flavors: indemnify, defend, and hold harmless. An example: licensees jointly and severally shall indemnify, defend, and hold harmless licensor from and against any and all third-party claims. So this is all of it. Um, Termination, let me see. Yeah, so we're really close. So I bet a bunch of people have to leave in about 5, 6 minutes because it's the end of their lunch break. We're going to keep going for those who can stick around, and we'll do some exercises, Q&A. But I'll punch a couple of things real quick, and then there's no summary, I guess. Termination. So when a contract actually ends, um, where do I want to go with this? I mean, basically, a contract ends, you know, it didn't work out. You'll say, oh, well, you're just looking for the termination clause. Like, what happens when it does end? When will it end? What happens if people still owe things to each other? Do I have to mail stuff back to you, like ownership of materials? So just really pay attention to the termination clause. They won't be in a lot of contracts. That's, I would say, something that gets missed often. And then dispute resolution. We'll come back to this. All right. Joel Andrew, red flags for work that I would recommend for creatives dealing with contracts. Really, red flags are really understand how this works. It doesn't mean don't accept these things. It's just really understand exactly how this works. Um, If you see a contract that the value that you are getting from this agreement is not money, but exclusively exposure, make sure you really understand what that means, because that can be a binding contract that you still have to follow through on the contract and do the things that you hired for, even though you get no money. And even though all the exposure is they just list you on an email. So just really watch out. There's a lot of creatives that do things for exposure, and exposure is super valuable, but just make sure you super understand how exposure is what you're getting for this deal. Next thing is watch out for language around all in, buyout, or perpetual. So maybe that's what you want, is you want to grant somebody an all-in right to own everything and they never have to come back to you. A buyout right is instead of licensing over and over, they just buy you out once. Instead of you getting $10 each month for the use of the royalty, they give you $100 today. Maybe that's totally worth it, but just really understand what a buyout is, because you're probably not going to get something after that. And then same with perpetual. If something is a perpetual license, a perpetual agreement, that means forever. And there are some legal magic rules around how to end perpetual, such as if you were actually, if a, whether or not a label bought something for you, your copyrights can be returned back to you, but just really watch out for all-in, buyout, and perpetual. Multi-party agreements. This is where things get really expensive and really complicated really quickly. When there is like a group of people working on a project, and let's say a client that wants to hire this group to work on a thing, and um, all of these people sign the contract along with this person. So there's a bunch of us putting together like a flower display, and there's six of us, and we're all going to promise to do all these different things. But there's just one counterparty. When they sue, there's this whole if things go down, who's responsible. It kind of reminds me of like when right out of high school, living with a bunch of roommates whose name is actually on the lease. That's who's going to get in trouble. Ultimately, multi-party agreements get really complicated and messy really quickly. The specific call out is with like a band signing to a label. If that entire band is what's signing to that contract, it's really complicated who is actually responsible for all this stuff. And there are times when four of those members have no money, one of those members has money, and that company gets to recoup all the money that all five of them owe. So just really watch out for multi-party agreements. See if you can't just do one contract with each individual. It makes it so much cleaner. Net and recoup. This is like you get paid a royalty of net revenues, or a recoup period. Somebody gets to recoup all the, yes, you created the design for them, but they have to go make a bunch, print a bunch of, or make a bunch of prints. They get to recoup those expenses before they pay you. That's common and that's fine, but just make sure the definition of net and definition of recoup are not vague. And make sure that you have some control over, being able to check that net is actually, that there were net, when they say that this is your net pay, you have some control to see how that calculation was made. So just really watch out for net and recoup. Again, you can accept these, but just make sure you understand them. Side letters and side agreements. I've seen this happen many times with creatives. Somebody signs the contract, but before they sign it, they're like, I'm really uncomfortable with this. And then the person who they're negotiating with says, oh, just sign it and we'll do a side letter and that'll be something different. They have no obligation to do that side letter. This is fully what the contract is. You're going to stand before a judge someday and say, this is what, they promised me all this other stuff, but if it's not in that contract, so watch out for side letters and side agreements and promises for side letters and side agreements. Don't sign the contract until what is promised is in it. And then oddly placed sentences. Uh, Back to the logic side, what I really, um, if there's a section that's pretty general about a rep and warranty, and then there's a very specific sentence in it, it's probably they added that because they had some sort of issue around it previously and historically. As an example, when you're going through like TSA at the airport or something like that, and they have like the wall of like all the various examples of things that you're not able to bring through, and there's like a pickaxe It's like they put that up there because somebody actually tried to bring a pickaxe through. That's what you're looking for is, again, contracts should be logical. And if something stands out to you as like, why is that sentence there like that? Ask them about it. Make sure you understand because there's probably either they're trying to be tricky or they've had some issues in the past that you're going to experience. Those are the Joel Andrew red flags. Again, you can agree to these, but just if you see these, you got to start asking questions and poke a bit more. Um, I know a lot of you have to bounce. I'm going to keep going on after a sip of water. So we were just at termination. Make sure you understand it's in a clause, how it works. So dispute resolution. So, and we'll do a quick lawsuit walkthrough between me and Sealy and how this will work out. But dispute resolution, there's going to be again, at the bottom of the contract, there's going to be a lot of boilerplate, and in it is probably going to be dispute resolution. It's going to talk about mandatory arbitration or mediation, or maybe no mediation. It's going to talk about choice of law and venue, and I'll explain all those things a little bit. But it is the most, I should have put the dog picture here. It is the most dry part of the contract, but it really impacts a lot of stuff. Um, so waiver of jury trial, sometimes that's put in there. If you have a contract dispute, you go to court, technically there should be a jury. And a jury is going to empathize with the creative way more than the business or the patron or anything like that. So be careful about waiving the right to a jury trial because if there's no jury, you can lose some leverage if you go to court. God forbid you go to court. Required arbitration or mediation. This is typically in benefit of the creative because, or seen as a benefit from the creative because they can afford mediation. They don't have to, it's usually a pretty voluntary thing. It's a few $100 until there's an award at the end. Usually it's an expert in your particular industry who's kind of looking at this, the kind of like the tribunal. They have a tribunal instead of a judge and jury, and that's like three to five people. And those all are people who have experience in your industry. But what happened, so it's like, oh, that's cool. Arbitration is less expensive, and we're going to work with an expert in my field. But where they get you is you're not allowed to pursue class action lawsuits if you're in arbitration or mediation. And so if you're working with Nike, I hope they do everything great or something like that. But if for some reason there was enough contractors who were like, hey, we have a real issue, and my minor $10,000 claim against Nike isn't enough to move it, we should pursue a potential class action. It could be any large corp. It's not just particularly Nike. You lose your right to pursue class action lawsuits if there's a required arbitration or mediation. Again, you can accept that. Maybe that's fine. Maybe it doesn't really matter, but just know that that's kind of what you're doing. Choice of law is each one of these states has a different law. Each because this is contract, even you'll learn in copyright fundamentals in November, copyright law is federal and will be done in federal court and uses federal law for copyright. Because this is actually contracts, this is going to be state law, which tons of nuances. Ultimately, each state has their own law of how contracts work. Um, Whether or not uh, yeah. Oh, each state has their own law, but then there's this other weird thing that's each contract states where the venue, basically where the court will be. So even though it's Oregon law, it's the choice of venue is Texas. So if you're seeing law, that's going to be what rule books they're looking at. And if you see venue, that means which courts you're actually going to. And I've seen really weird stuff in contracts, just kind of strategic stuff where like I'm just a creative here in Oregon who's trying to like make an album and put it out on our label, but our label's out of Texas, and my contract, my label agreement says that if I want to sue them, I have to go to Texas and sue them. And I don't have money for that. And so you're just kind of be wary of the things that you're exchanging for that. And attorney's fees. Sometimes they will say in the agreement that you have to, the winner will have to pay attorney's fees, or there's a right to collect attorney's fees. But for the most part in the US, the default rule is everybody has to pay for their own attorney's fees, whether they're the winner or the loser. So again, you can accept all of these things, but if it's getting overly difficult and one-sided, I think it's appropriate to point out like like, hey, this is very business friendly and not creative friendly. Can we address some of these other points? Like, I'd like to make another percent, or I'd like, the agreement to go a month shorter, or something like that. So just highlighting these are all things to negotiate. So dispute resolution, quick lawsuit walkthrough, musician and designer. What this, we're going to walk through a few different things. I think it's eye-opening for a lot of creatives to understand how a lawsuit works and how it comes out of a contract. So that's what we're going to do right here. I'm suspension of of belief. This is a new total reality. I am a musician who is looking to self-release an album in about 2 months. And Celie is this world-class designer. I'm lucky to work with her, and she is willing to do my album cover design for like 1,200 bucks, which is really cool. And so my album comes out in 2 months. Celie says that the project will be done in a month from now. This is all going to work out. This is great. We sign a basic contract that says exactly that. The purpose, Celie's profession, is this her LLC? Maybe you learned that in the business fundamentals in the last month. Is she an LLC or is sole operator? All that sort of stuff. Is it my LLC? Goes into the kind of preamble and the beginning of the contract. Then we start going into definitions of like, what is this, what does this artwork have to look like? What are the file formats? Is this layout or is this just like an illustration? All these different things into the definitions. Payment terms. She has to deliver this by November 1st, and I have to pay her $1,200 on November 1st. And everything's cool. Everything seems really simple. Choice of law, Oregon, Multnomah County, all that sort of fun stuff. This is contract. So what happens is, as often happens, but not between us, but just in the creative world, what often happens is I get my design back and I don't like it. And I don't think it's going to work for my album. And I go back to Celie and I go like, hey, Celie, this like it looks cool, but I'm a metal band and this just doesn't like I can't put this on my album cover. I need your help. And Celie comes back and says, yeah, sure, another 400 bucks and I can tweak it up and make it a lot better for you. And I would go like, whoa, whoa, wait, I hired you to like create the album cover for my album, and this is just not acceptable. And Celie is going, and I think that that's appropriate to kind of have that perspective. But Celie also appropriately is going, you paid me to do the work, and you paid me to have a vision and a perspective. I checked in with you about a few the things that I thought you would care about, but ultimately I did the work that you paid me to do, and if you want me to do more work after the fact, you're going to have to pay me to do more. That's a very reasonable position as well. I think they're both reasonable. I kind of have my own interpretation of like how it would go, but now we're in a dispute. And I feel like this is a breach of contract. Celie didn't deliver what she was supposed to promise to me. And Celie's coming back and going like, I did deliver what I was promising to you. So what I would be seeking here is to sue Celie. No, no, no. Let's make it more clear. Uh, or yeah, I end up using, no, let's see here. Let's keep it straight. So long hour, excuse me. So this is a breach of contract. I paid Celie $1,200 in advance to kind of like get all this work done. Let's say that I paid her before, and I got the artwork, and I don't think it's good, and she's not giving me my money back because she already did the work. And again, that could be very appropriate depending on the terms of the contract. But we're just in the contract wasn't clear enough of how this dispute part is supposed to go because we used ChatGPT and it just didn't address this part, something like that. So here, that's a dispute. She has my money, and appropriately so because she did the work. I don't have a design that I can actually use, appropriately so because it doesn't work at all with a metal album that I think that Celia should have understood. So I'm going to sue her for my 1,200 bucks. And I would, one potential option is to go full, I guess nuclear is what it's called, and sue her in court and file paperwork. And I would probably hire an attorney and just some rough numbers and all of that as you're gauging this. It's easily $10,000 to hire an attorney to sue somebody and it go all the way through to a jury trial. There's multiple steps before it gets to that, but it's probably $10,000 and it could be anywhere from 2 to 3 years of just ongoing litigation and responses back and forth. This one's pretty straightforward, so there's ways to potentially mitigate that. But it could easily, if we were both so vehement and independently wealthy that we wanted to pursue this all the way till the end, yeah, it's probably $10,000 low, that's a low range. It could go up very high from there. And again, like 2 to 3 years before it's clear how any of this works. And for a $1,200 dispute, that really blows all of that out of the picture. And so I mention all of this because I talk to clients in the OVLA who come in asking about lawsuits. And it's like, this isn't, first of all, OVLA doesn't do litigation. We can kind of help you do pre-litigation work and kind of advise where you should go, but we don't help on that side. But when we're talking through it, is like, you should just really understand this is like tens of thousands of dollars to just, and if you win, you merely get the benefit, the damages from the contract. They don't pay your legal fees unless it specifically says in the contract who pays the legal fees, and it almost never does. So you're out $10,000, $20,000 for a $1,200 breach. So there's other potential solutions, and that's where like arbitration or mediation comes in. In Oregon, there's a small claims court, so you don't even have to hire an attorney to file a lawsuit against somebody. And it's more of like the people's court or Judge Judy-esque type things. Fill out some paperwork in advance. You go stand before a judge. You both kind of share your side of the story, and then they tell you what the judgment is. And that's for cases less than $10,000. And I think that is the right thing for you don't get to sue for like your lost time or your lost work or anything like that. But that's kind of um, how that dispute would work. So we don't go to court, or we do go to court, or I'm threatening to take her to small claims court. But we both agree that that's just a total waste of both of our times. We are both creatives. We just want to do creative stuff. We're not in this world to litigate. So let's strike to a settlement. And that's just a renegotiation. It's basically a new contract. And so we both know we can't afford $10,000 to fight this thing. So a $1,200 dispute. I think the reasonable approach that I would take is I would go like, hey, I would accept some culpability. I would hope Sealy would accept some culpability, and we just settle on like, hey, you know, I'll do another edit for, half price, another, touch up. I'll do that same work for $200 instead of $400. And then that settlement, we would create a whole new contract that's just for that settlement. So even though I want to, I guess, clarify that at the end of, if there's a dispute, great. You can always seek to settle. And in that settlement, once you come to the same page, it's just a new contract that should also be documented. It could be DIY or go online and just kind of like, find a template for a settlement. But it's going to similarly say how the relationship works and all that sort of good stuff. So, company specific contracts, I know we only got about 15 minutes, so I'll run through these pretty quickly. And just if you ever see a non-disclosure agreement, they're always the same. They're almost always the same. Uh, and sometimes they're a mutual non-disclosure agreement. The only things that are, and if you're going to work, I don't think that they're always necessary because the amount of times that like a client or a creative's working with a client that they're actually touching like sensitive or confidential info is pretty low. It happens for sure, but they are pretty standard though. So they all look the same, pretty, make sure everybody's taking things seriously. If somebody asks you for an NDA, you can probably grab that. This would be an area where an online form would be probably pretty functional. At least meet you there, make sure you understand what it says. But again, very boilerplate. I could draft one in my sleep right now because they all say the same thing. So you just see them over and over and over. But where things get weird is term. So make sure that it's not like perpetual and that it's for a reasonable 3 to 5 years or something like that. That like the non-disclosure ends. And then this is really so that way they can share information with you that you can't turn around and then go try to sell or practice on or market. And so it should really only cover confidential info. If it's covering stuff that doesn't have to do with any confidential info, it's worth asking. But a lot of companies just require it because that's what they were trained to do. Service agreements, master service agreements. A lot of people don't like the use of master. I understand it. So I think there's a shift in the industry towards just calling it service agreement, even though you will still see MSA. That works in conjunction with a statement of work or an SOW. So this is pretty common for creatives. The MSA is the contract that controls the whole relationship. So you'll frequently negotiate terms of like, when are deliverables due, confidential information, that you're a contractor, all these different things. And then follow up with each specific job that you do. There will be a statement of work. So let's say that you're a graphic designer for a small business, that needs some continuous design work. It would be common to have an MSA in place so that way they can reach out to you for additional work when they need it. And then you would just create a new statement of work or an SOW. These, again, really common templates that I see online are pretty standard. The service agreement is where the meat goes. The statement of work is usually pretty light and just kind of like describing how it works, how the money flow or and the cost. So basically, service agreement says what the relationship is, how the money works, some legal terms, and then the statement of work is specifically describing what the work is that you're going to be doing. Work for hire, we talked a little bit about that. And again, totally sign up for copyright fundamentals, but work for hire will impact whether or not you're keeping the rights or they get the rights. Assignment of IP, do you get to keep the IP? Are they get assignment, or is it assigning to them? Those things really matter. So just watch out. Contractor agreement. You see a lot of these. Sometimes they're baked into the MSA, sometimes they're separate. This is ultimately an employer or a business trying to make sure you don't get set up as registered as an employee. If you do get registered as if you become an employee to them, even though they say you're just a contractor, but like realistically, you actually are an employee. It triggers some benefits for you through the state, triggers some employer taxes for them. So a lot of employers are really trying to mitigate and make sure that these contractors that they're working with are just properly contractors. The real thing to watch out for is right to control. If you're a contractor, they can't control your work or how they can define when it's due and deliverable, but you don't have punch-in times or any of that. That's when they're starting to control you. And if they control you, you're an employee and you get, again, these benefits and they pay employer taxes. So you're watching for right to control. A W-9 and a 1099, that's going to come out a lot with kind of contractor creatives. W-9 is there. You can pre-make a W-9. It's just a federal form online and it's going to have your social security number or EI or employer identification number if that's how you set your LLC up. And that's what you're providing to the company. So that way they can take care of their taxes. And then 1099 is what they're going to report to you, usually on a yearly basis of kind of how much money they pay to you so you can file your own taxes. Commercial leases, a lot of creatives have to have their own spaces. So just this is one of the most complex and heavily litigated areas in the industry. And though I absolutely hire commercial real estate experts, and there are a bunch of them in Portland that specifically work with creative or have historically worked with creatives for other projects. So they really get it. But just it's very logical. There is magic language in throughout all of it, but this is a common one that you'll see, and it pretty complex. License agreements. This could be in the MSA or even this statement of work or a contractor agreement. But ultimately, this is where you're creating something and they're just licensing the right to use or display or make derivative works or something like that. So granting language, just really, if it's a license, just really watch out for works made for hire and assignments. Venue, event performance. I think the only thing that I really high, all of it's pretty straightforward. Um, Sometimes you know, backlines, all that sort of stuff. If you work in this industry, I think you'd understand it. Uh, let's see. I think the big one is waivers and whether or not you need a waiver, and like, yeah, recording of event and stuff like that. Just know that there's rules about whether or not you can just record a live event that you're doing and how. And also that sometimes you need a waiver in order to do that because even if it's not legal, it's still like pretty impolite to just start recording people and posting it on your YouTube. Get legal help. Yeah, I'll leave it like this.